What's up, weirdos? My name's Felicia and I like scary movies, and today I am honestly delighted, is that the word, to be talking about scary stories to tell in the dark. I have brought up my copies of the 3 volumes of scary stories to talk about today as I talk about this new movie. So as soon as I found out they were turning it into a movie, I felt this like huge excitement. It was something more than that though, because these books, I found them, I remember so vividly finding them in my elementary school library and just sitting between the bookshelves and looking at it. And I remember opening the first one and then just flipping through and seeing these images and feeling like, oh, I am not supposed to be looking at this. Like, it had that feeling of something like dangerous. And I remember just being so fascinated with them. I've always had an interest in the supernatural, in mortality. I've always just been really fascinated by these things. And I can't think of what would have started it before these books. Like, these books are what got me into horror as a small child before I even had seen any horror movies. Like, this was it. Like, this is it. And so I feel such a huge nostalgic and love for these books, and particularly the illustrations by Stephen Gammell. If you don't know, these books are collected stories. They're collected from different folk tales and urban legends from multiple cultures, all collected and reinterpreted by Alvin Schwartz, and then all the drawings are by Stephen Gammell, okay? And guys, like, I know, I feel like I checked that book out of my library 100 times. I don't even know how many times I read these stories, and it's crazy because I hadn't looked at them in years and years. And then I think maybe 2 years ago-ish, I ordered these because I was just on Amazon and I saw them in a pack, like in a box like this, and I just was like, I have to have those. How do I not own those? I have to have those. And I also remember that first time of going back through them and remembering almost every one. And I have a terrible, I have an awful memory. Like, I am someone that very much is like always thinking in the future and almost never thinking in the past, which is good and bad. But I just remember so vividly every picture. And then some stories surprised me, some made me laugh, some I was like, dang, this is like a lot of cannibalism. Like, this is really freaky. These ghost stories are really scary. And I'm sure this is like me rambled on for like too long now, but I love these books. And so when I walked into this movie yesterday, I went by myself because I knew I wanted to go on opening. And I walked in and I sat in the theater by myself and I felt like a kid again. Like, I felt that moment of like the little bit of fear and the little bit of like excitement of just like, what have they done with this thing that means so much to me? And what I'm discovering through social media, which is really, really cool, is that so many people had this experience that I had, because I didn't grow up with a ton of people that were interested in horror and spooky stuff. Even in the last few years, like, I have a couple of friends that I can talk about it with, and then I have all of you guys. But I didn't grow up with a lot of people that were interested in this stuff, so I always felt reading these stories was a very solitary activity for me. I was always looking at them by myself. And then sitting in that theater waiting for this movie to start, and I'm looking around and there's all these people that are around my age, and I was also like scrolling through Instagram of people that were going to the movie and stuff, and I was like, oh my god, like, all these people were me, and we're all like coming together now to have a communal experience from what was a very solitary experience. And I just think that's so like freaking special. Okay, now that I've rambled for a very long time, let's talk about the movie. So as I'm sure you know, because it was very apparent in the marketing, this was produced by Guillermo del Toro. I'm a huge del Toro fan, and I can really feel his presence in this movie. It was written by Dan and Kevin Hageman, and it was directed by Andre Overdahl. So before even going in, I felt very, very comfortable with this team. Obviously, I love del Toro's work, and I love Andre's work. He directed Autopsy of Jane Doe, which I love that movie. He also directed Troll Hunter. He's a Norwegian filmmaker, and I love, the other thing I was excited about this movie is you have 3 different people from 3 different cultures. You have del Toro, who's Mexican. You have Overdahl, who's from Norway, and then you have these 2 American dudes. And it's such an interesting thing because these books are collected from a bunch of different cultures, and then you had like these 3 people from different cultures bringing it into film, and I was like, oh, this is gonna be good. And I really had so much faith in it. So I'm gonna go ahead and say from the bottom of my heart, I loved everything about this movie. I'm sure you guys have already heard some reviews. I haven't looked up too many reviews yet, but I feel amazed and infatuated with it. First of all, it's PG-13, which I think is right. Like, we want that in between where we can be scary and we can do some crazy things, but it's still for young people. It's still for young, hungry people that want to be introduced to horror, even if they don't know it yet. It feels like that gateway drug movie for young people to get really interested in horror movies. And I feel so excited by that because I feel like when I was young, and even more so, I grew up in the 90s, and I would say even more so in the 80s, we had a lot darker children's movies coming out that really scared kids. And what's funny is if you go back to like even grim fairy tales that were told to children, it's like they're scary because fear is a part of life and fear is really important. And I think there's nothing wrong with scaring children. I know that sounds like kind of weird. And I think in the last 10 to 15 years, we have gotten very, very vanilla with children's horror stuff. I think even the new Goosebumps thing, which is fun, like the Goosebumps movies were very fun, but they weren't dark enough. They didn't really like feed that darkness that is inside of all of us in this way. It was sort of just like playing with it instead of really like showing it. And this movie had the darkness. Like, it was, honestly, it was scary. And that's the other thing, that's like, I would say my number one thing that I just am so impressed by is that I had fear watching this movie. I was scared. There were moments, I had multiple moments where I was just like, oh, like they're really, like I was physically reacting to the film, which is what you want in a horror movie. Like, that's why we go. We want to have visceral experiences. We don't want to just sit there bored for 2 hours. Like this, I was like laughing, I was making noise, and then I was like feeling grossed out, I was feeling excited. Like I went through a full experience, and yes, I'm sure a lot of that was the nostalgia, but also just effective filmmaking. And I was like, right, like this, like I said, the perfect gateway horror movie. And I think the main thing that made this movie so scary were the creatures, and that is what's scariest in these books. So I'm gonna go through, I tried to, on my subway ride today, like mark through a few of these and see which ones I found, just so we can not like compare and contrast, but just so you guys can get a visual of how well done these creatures are in this movie. Like, yes, they're very Del Toro in a way, but they're also, they're so gamble. Like the pictures are what make this book terrifying. Like this image, this is scary for a freaking first grader. Do you know what I mean? Like this is really scary, but it's also like fascinating, right? Because you're like, I don't even know what this is. Like it's exciting. It feels, like I said, dangerous. It's awesome. And like the illustrations, like, I mean, like, look at this. It's freaking beautiful. Okay, so let me just go through a little bit here. Actually, a few of the monsters in the movie came from the third book, which is More Tales to Chill Your Bones. So there are 3 books to this. So in this, we do have Harold. And I think the Harold that they've created for this movie, I mean, look at this, is so close to the book. It's so exciting. And then here you have the Pale Woman, and here's the one from the film. I mean, it's really pretty spectacular how well they did with this. Then of course we had the Big Toe, which that one for me definitely grossed me out the most in the movie, and I was really excited by that, how they interpreted that story. The Red Spot, I loved how they did the Red Spot with her in that bright pink dress. That was like really very like Edward Scissorhands or something like that, like those kind of vibes. Like it had sort of a Tim Burton feel to it, which I thought was really fun. The Jangly Man, from what I can tell, seems to be a mashup of a couple of the stories. It starts out with the Me Tai Doti Walker, and then has the one where all the different body parts fall out of the chimney, things like that. They also used the Hearse song, and I think the Hearse song is actually in multiple of these books, but in it they literally show you the notes so you can sing the Hearse song. Like that is brilliant. It's just brilliant. Okay. And then the one that I think I loved the interpretation of the most, not necessarily the monster itself, but just the interpretation of the story, was the haunted house. And that sort of really comes into play towards the end of the movie. And I'm gonna talk more about the movie now. This video is probably a little all over the place, but I'm gonna talk through the rest of the movie, and then at the end I am gonna share with you guys my favorite story out of the Scary Story series. I don't know if I'm legally allowed to just read it on camera, but I'll tell you which one it is. The next thing I loved about it was the humor in it. The other thing about these books is that they're funny. There's the one that about the window washer who's like, I wish to wipe your windows. I'm really like speaking in references here. If you've not read the books, this might be difficult for you. But there is a lot of humor infused into these books, and so in some stories you're like scared, and then other ones you're laughing out loud, and like that is like the perfect mix of what this movie also had. I also loved the kid actors in this. I thought they were just spot on. They were like the right age too. They weren't too young, but they weren't like full on into teenagehood yet. I really liked Zoe Colletti, who played Stella, our main leading lady. It was also hilarious because throughout the movie, I'm a theater nerd, and throughout the movie they keep screaming Stella, and if you get that joke, leave a heart in the comments, because you a theater nerd too. I also loved, like, one of the stars for me was Austin Zodger, who played Chuck. I just felt like I knew that kid. Like, I feel like everything about his character, I was like, I know that kid. Like, that kid went to my middle school. Like, the goofy kid, he was such a good actor. I really, really liked him. The next big thing I want to talk about is the time in which this movie is set. So they set it in 1968, which was in the Vietnam War and right around when Nixon was about to be elected. And I just thought that was so smart. And you see it a lot throughout the movie. You see a lot of like speeches going on the TVs and things like that. But it's just so smart because you have this war going on where a lot of protests are happening about the draft, right? Because people think that America is sending their kids to die, sending boys off to die. No one's coming home. A character in the movie has his older brother die, and then he has to go sign up for the draft because it's like the law, and it's this really scary time in America, right? And so you have this thing of like children dying because of war, and then you also have, no spoilers, an entity killing children in these scary stories. And so it's just like this really smart duality going on. I just loved that. We also had the thing of the draft having kids grow up too fast, like this character in the movie that you just feel like is so young. Like, it's hard to imagine him going off to war and into battle because he feels like a kid, and he is. I just think that was a really smart backdrop for this film. All right, I think that's all I want to talk about. I guess my main points are that I loved that it was actually scary. I thought the monsters were beautifully horrifying. I thought the humor was great. I thought the acting was great. The overall vibe of the movie is honestly everything I've ever wanted. I loved it. And now, before we go, I'm just gonna share with you my favorite of the scary stories. Okay, just so you know, this is ripped out of my book for a reason. I taught a devising horror theater workshop at high school, and I ripped out the pages because I didn't have a printer, and this was like, it doesn't matter. Okay. So this is my favorite story, and it is The Girl Who Stood on the Grave. So this one is about a girl whose friends dare her to go into a graveyard and stick a knife into a grave. And apparently the ghost will then grab her and pull her down and kill her, right? And so she goes in, she does it, and she feels something holding onto her dress. And then at the end of the story, she dies, and you realize that she stabbed the knife through her own dress into the grave, and she died of fright, okay? So that story I always felt like was the most impactful for me, because fear can ruin you. Fear can hold you back from things you want to do in your life. It can be detrimental. And so I think this story for me as a small child sort of reminded me, or taught me, that you can be scared, but you can't let it take over your life, right? And this version, she literally dies from it. And I just always thought that was really fascinating to me, and it always was my favorite tale. But I think that's it for this video, guys. I'm not even sure this is a review. It's just more of a talk about the movie. I'm gonna get on here and talk about scary stories to tell in the dark because it means a lot to me, and I'm sure it means a lot to a lot of you. Let me know down below if you've seen the movie yet, if you're planning on seeing it. I'm also gonna put the Amazon link down in the description if you guys wanna order these books for yourself. I'm telling you, it's one of my favorite Amazon purchases I've ever made, so highly recommend. And that's it, guys. I hope you have a great weekend and have a nice scream. Bye.